What if I told you that stupidity isn't merely the absence of intelligence, but something far more dangerous, a corrosive force capable of twisting even the sharpest minds into agents of ruin? What if the gravest threat to civilization isn't malevolence, but rather the quiet epidemic of people ceasing to think? Imagine this scene: a world-renowned scientist, holder of multiple advanced degrees, suddenly begins to embrace and disseminate falsehoods that place countless lives at risk. A devoted teacher, driven by compassion, starts championing ideologies that slowly erode the very values they once taught. A caring parent, motivated by love, makes choices that place their own children in harm's way. These individuals aren't evil. They're not fools. They're intelligent, well-intentioned, and yet they've fallen prey to something Dietrich Bonhoeffer chillingly described as the power of stupidity. And here's the unsettling part: it's not some distant, abstract phenomenon that happens to others. It's unfolding all around us. It's happening to people we know. People like you. People like me. This is not mere philosophical musing. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted his now infamous obedience experiments at Yale University. In these studies, everyday volunteers were instructed by an authoritative figure to administer what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another participant. Despite hearing screams of agony, 65% of the subjects continued delivering shocks they thought might be lethal. These weren't sadists or sociopaths. They were ordinary people temporarily surrendering their ability to make independent moral judgments. This is the very dynamic Bonhoeffer witnessed firsthand, as the world around him spiraled into one of history's darkest chapters. From these observations, he formulated one of the most chilling and profound theories about human nature ever conceived. But before we dive deeper into his haunting insights, I must ask you a simple, yet piercing question. Have you ever found yourself believing something simply because everyone around you believed it? 2. Hold on to that thought, because what we are about to explore may very well be one of the most vital psychological revelations of our time. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't some detached philosopher pontificating from the comfort of an ivory tower. He was a German Lutheran pastor, standing in the eye of the storm as his entire society unraveled. Born in 1906 into a family of intellectual giants, his father, a leading psychiatrist and neurologist, Bonhoeffer, grew up surrounded by an unshakable faith in the power of education, reason, and discourse. Yet, as the Nazi Party ascended to power, Bonhoeffer witnessed something that shattered his trust in human rationality. He watched his fellow Germans, educated, cultured, deeply religious people embrace leaders and policies that stood in direct contradiction to everything they claimed to hold dear. These weren't uneducated masses swept away by clever propaganda. They were professors, doctors, clergy, intellectuals. They weren't manipulated, they willingly surrendered their minds. From the confines of his prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer penned what would become his most haunting reflection: against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor force accomplish anything here. Arguments fall on deaf ears. The terror of this statement lies not just in its historical context, but in its brutal precision. Evil, Bonhoeffer observed, contains within it the seeds of its own collapse. It generates discomfort, opposition, and ultimately resistance. But stupidity is far more insidious. It masquerades as virtue. It believes itself to be righteous, and that self-assurance renders it nearly impervious to correction. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most unsettling insight was that stupidity functions as a tool of existing power structures. The malicious know they're doing wrong, They live with internal contradictions that eventually erode their stability. But those ensnared by what he called functional stupidity believe they're acting for the greater good, which makes them almost invulnerable to self-doubt or reflection. And this isn't accidental. Power doesn't need to crush dissent directly. It merely needs to create an environment where honest, critical thinking becomes too difficult, too costly. When Bonhoeffer spoke of stupidity, he wasn't referring to low IQ or a lack of education. He pointed to something far more complex: willful ignorance, a kind of cognitive surrender rooted not in inability, but in systemic pressures that discourage independent thought. In his letters from prison, he wrote, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one feels they are not dealing with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and ideologies that have taken possession of him." This is where Bonhoeffer's theory becomes deeply disturbing and startlingly relevant. Stupidity, he argued, is not primarily the result of personal failings, but of environmental conditions that actively penalize independent thinking. The world we live in today exemplifies his warnings with astonishing clarity. Our economic systems reward intellectual shortcuts. Social media giants profit by stoking emotional reactions rather than encouraging thoughtful reflection. News outlets thrive on outrage, not nuance. Politicians win elections through catchy slogans, not complex policy discussions. Meanwhile, ordinary people juggle multiple jobs, drown in debt, and are bombarded by an endless stream of fragmented information. In this suffocating environment, surrendering one's intellectual agency becomes a coping mechanism. Economists call it rational ignorance. It's more efficient to remain uninformed than to expend the immense time and energy required to understand complex realities. But what emerges from this individual rationality is collective insanity. The exact phenomenon Bonhoeffer identified in Nazi Germany continues to echo in our modern world. What we witness is not merely personal choice, it's the crushing weight of structural pressures that incentivize intellectual surrender, and, tragically, our own biology conspires against us. While external systems push us toward mental shortcuts, our brains are perfectly designed to comply. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s revealed how fiercely we protect our existing beliefs. When confronted with information that contradicts what we think we know, the brain instinctively resists. And as Bonhoeffer foresaw, modern psychology confirms that these defensive mechanisms intensify under stress, uncertainty, and economic strain, exactly the circumstances engineered by our current systems. Bonhoeffer observed that stupidity thrives most in groups. He wrote, "It becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one." He saw how rational individuals abandon their critical faculties when submerged into collective movements, a phenomenon decades ahead of its time. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments validated this insight. Participants were placed in a group where Confederates deliberately gave incorrect answers to obvious questions. 75% of subjects conformed to the group at least once, even when they knew the group was wrong. Now imagine this principle operating at scale in the digital age. Social media algorithms manufacture tailor-made echo chambers, making this process even more dangerous. A 2018 MIT study revealed that false information spreads 6 times faster than truth on these platforms. Why? Because misinformation often feels more emotionally satisfying than the messy complexities of reality. When someone shares content that confirms their worldview, they become complicit in a system that rewards simplicity over depth. The algorithm responds by feeding them more of the same, tightening the grip of intellectual quicksand. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems perfectly aligned with your existing beliefs? That's not coincidence. It's a design, a deliberate architecture of chosen ignorance. We've seen this pattern echo throughout history, an eerie repetition of collective surrender masquerading as moral certainty. Consider the Salem witch trials. These weren't the acts of inherently evil individuals. They were God-fearing townsfolk, utterly convinced they were safeguarding their communities from a demonic threat. They acted not out of malice, but out of a misguided sense of virtue. Or take the Red Scare of the 1950s. That wave of paranoia wasn't fueled by villainous operatives seeking to deceive the masses. It was carried forward by millions of patriotic Americans who genuinely believed they were defending their nation from communist infiltration. Time and again, we observe the same unsettling phenomenon: intelligent, educated, well-meaning people teachers, judges, journalists, doctors abandoning their critical faculties in the name of emotional security and group consensus. This is the danger Bonhoeffer saw with frightening clarity. He recognized that once people surrender their intellectual independence to the comforting simplicity of collective narratives, they are no longer truly thinking, they are reacting. And yet, if our neurological wiring, our economic pressures, and our social structures are all aligned against us, one might ask, is there any way to resist? Bonhoeffer believed there was, but he was painfully honest about the cost. He called it costly grace, the courageous act of independent thought, undertaken precisely when it's most painful, most isolating, and most dangerous. The refusal to outsource one's mind, even at great personal risk. Today, we understand that breaking free from stupidity isn't merely a matter of willpower. We're battling not just cultural pressures, but evolutionary instincts and billion-dollar algorithms meticulously engineered to exploit our mental vulnerabilities. So how do we resist? On an individual level, we can begin by cultivating what psychologists now term intellectual humility, the disciplined recognition that our knowledge is always partial, always subject to error. It means acknowledging, consistently and without ego, that even our most cherished beliefs deserve scrutiny, that we must intentionally expose our convictions to contradiction, not to torment ourselves, but to ensure those beliefs remain grounded in reality rather than comfort. There are several practical exercises that serve as daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, embrace intellectual friction. Deliberately seek out thoughtful arguments from those who disagree with you. Don't approach them as enemies to defeat, but as opportunities to pressure test your own thinking. Can your views withstand genuine opposition? If not, why? Second, practice productive ignorance. Whenever you feel absolutely certain about something, pause and ask yourself, what evidence could change my mind? If you can't identify any, that's a warning sign. Certainty without openness is fertile ground for stupidity. Third, adopt a simple but powerful habit. Slow down your sharing. In our hyper-connected world, where every impulse can be instantly amplified, a 60-second pause to verify information before posting can break the cycle of reactionary misinformation. And fourth, perhaps most radical of all practice, saying, I don't know. In an environment where blustering confidence is often rewarded over quiet honesty, admitting ignorance is an act of intellectual rebellion. But Bonhoeffer understood something even deeper: personal vigilance, while essential, is not sufficient. The structures that cultivate and reward stupidity must also be confronted. That means demanding structural transparency from the platforms that shape our digital realities. Social media companies must be held accountable for disclosing how their algorithms curate content, amplify outrage, and entrench division. It means investing in widespread media literacy, education, arming people with the skills to evaluate sources, question narratives, and discern manipulation from truth. It means reimagining digital ecosystems to incentivize intellectual humility over tribal certainty, creating spaces where asking questions is more rewarded than shouting answers. And most importantly, it means addressing the material conditions that leave people vulnerable to surrendering their minds. When individuals aren't constantly crushed by anxiety over healthcare, housing, and financial survival, they regain the mental bandwidth necessary for complex thinking. In truth, Bonhoeffer's insight was brilliant for his time, but modern neuroscience has uncovered something even more unsettling. This isn't just a battle against bad actors or oppressive regimes. It's a confrontation with the architecture of our own cognition. Bonhoeffer bore witness to Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radios. That alone was horrifying. But today, we face exponentially more sophisticated threats. We've moved from state-run propaganda to algorithmic manipulation, where artificial intelligence fine-tunes the precise psychological levers that dictate human behavior. And now, as we cross into the era of AI-generated deepfakes, where entire realities can be fabricated with stunning believability, the threat has not only escalated, it has become deeply personalized. Every click you make, every video you watch, every moment you hesitate while scrolling, each data point is meticulously catalogued and used to refine a feedback loop engineered to bypass your reasoning mind and prey directly on your emotional core. We are no longer simply facing propaganda. We are facing systems that weaponize human cognition itself. Bonhoeffer's diagnosis was terrifyingly prescient people gravitate towards simplified narratives when they feel threatened and uncertain. And those narratives, once adopted, render individuals almost entirely impervious to contradictory evidence. The mechanism is simple, and devastating stress leads to uncertainty. Uncertainty craves clarity. Clarity arrives through emotionally satisfying, simplistic answers. And with each repetition of that cycle, the mind becomes increasingly closed. Today, we face a landscape where artificial intelligence has become the most efficient architect of that cycle ever devised. Every moment of interaction is analyzed, measured, and optimized to feed you content that confirms your biases, inflames your passions, and erodes your capacity for independent judgment. We saw this manifest in real time during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, highly intelligent individuals, fully capable of analytical reasoning, began promoting disproven theories about vaccines and treatments. These were not failures of raw intellect. They were collapses of independent thought under unprecedented psychological and social pressure. Bonhoeffer's insights proved devastatingly accurate. Once again, intelligence alone does not shield us. Only the deliberate cultivation of intellectual independence offers any protection. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for his refusal to surrender his mind. On the 9th of April, 1945, just weeks before the fall of Nazi Germany, he was executed by hanging. His final words, as recorded by a fellow prisoner, echoed his defiant clarity: "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." But Bonhoeffer's sacrifice was never solely about politics. It was a defense of something even more sacred, the capacity for human thought itself. For he understood that when people cease to think for themselves, they forfeit their very humanity. They transform into what he described as puppets, with their strings pulled by whichever force happens to dominate the moment. And so, he left behind a question that reverberates with haunting relevance even now: who stands fast? Who holds their ground when the tidal waves of conformity rise, when the price of truth becomes unbearably steep, when thinking independently means isolation? Criticism. or danger, who refuses to yield. The answer, Bonhoeffer argued, is not found in superior intellect or advanced education. It lies in the daily discipline of choosing curiosity over certainty, the stubborn commitment to seek truth even when falsehood offers comfort, the resilience to think carefully while others eagerly react. These are not grand, heroic acts performed on public stages. They are small, private battles fought in the quiet chambers of the mind battles that become extraordinary precisely because so few are willing to fight them anymore. There is a tragic irony at the heart of this struggle. Intellectual surrender often masquerades as liberation. Thinking, truly thinking, is grueling work. It requires holding conflicting ideas simultaneously, entertaining the possibility of one's own error, and resisting the urge to resolve discomfort with easy answers. And yet, Bonhoeffer insisted, this discomfort is not a curse, it is the price of retaining one's humanity. In a world that thrives on our mental submission, the simple act of independent thought becomes an act of rebellion. Here lies the most unsettling truth. None of us are immune. The moment we begin to believe we are, we've already started to drift into the very stupidity Bonhoeffer warned against. The price of intellectual freedom, as he understood, is eternal vigilance, not against some external enemy, but against the internal lure of mental surrender whenever thinking becomes difficult. Look around. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity isn't merely historical, it's alive everywhere. Intelligent people, clinging to obviously false beliefs. Educated citizens supporting policies that contradict their professed values. Entire societies marching confidently into catastrophes while convinced of their righteousness. The problem is not that people have grown less intelligent. The problem is that the systems surrounding us reward intellectual shortcuts, emotional certainty, and tribal loyalty far more than they reward careful, independent reasoning. And yet within this diagnosis lies real hope, because if stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it arises from cognitive overwhelm, environments can be created that foster clarity rather than confusion. Think of critical thinking not as an innate gift, but as a muscle, one that requires constant exercise to remain strong. Just as no one expects to run a marathon without training, we should not expect to navigate complex realities without regularly challenging our minds. The next time you feel absolutely certain about a belief, the next time you instinctively dismiss opposing views without examination, the next time you enjoy the reassuring comfort of already having all the answers, pause. In that moment, remember, Bonhoeffer's warning, functional stupidity, does not declare itself loudly. It whispers gently, reassuring you that you already know everything you need to know, and in that instant, you face a choice. Do you surrender to the seductive ease of certainty, or do you accept the more painful, more demanding path of intellectual independence? For Bonhoeffer, the core question was never about how intelligent we are, it was about how committed we are to keep thinking when thinking becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world engineered to profit from our intellectual surrender, the act of sustained thought is nothing short of radical defiance. Here's my challenge to you. One simple act of intellectual courage. Identify one belief you hold deeply. Spend just 30 minutes researching the strongest arguments against it. Not to destabilize yourself, not to breed paralyzing doubt, but to practice the discipline of intellectual integrity that Bonhoeffer gave his life defending. If your belief withstands scrutiny, you'll emerge stronger. Your conviction more deeply rooted in truth. If it falters, you'll have gained something even more valuable, the rare humility to distinguish conviction from illusion. The future of human dignity may very well depend on how many of us are willing to engage in this kind of disciplined thought, because in a world meticulously designed to profit from our intellectual capitulation, simply choosing to think carefully becomes the most potent form of resistance we have left. And remember this, every time you choose curiosity over dogma, evidence over emotion, reflection over reaction, you are doing more than protecting your own mind. You are defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age increasingly defined by artificial stupidity. In this battle for the preservation of independent thought, it is crucial to recognize that the danger we face is not merely philosophical, it is biological, psychological, and systemic. Bonhoeffer's insights give us a powerful framework, but modern science allows us to see the full architecture of this threat with even greater clarity. Our brains were never designed for the complexity of the modern information age. They evolved for survival in an entirely different world, a world of immediate dangers and quick decisions. Where hesitation could mean death, speed mattered more than accuracy. Familiarity was trusted over novelty. Certainty was preferred over doubt. These were once adaptive features of human cognition, designed to protect us in an environment filled with predators, scarcity, and tribal threats. But in the intricate web of our contemporary existence, those same survival mechanisms have become profound vulnerabilities. The same brain that once kept our ancestors alive now struggles to process the overwhelming flood of information, manipulation, and complexity that defines modern life, and it is precisely here that the power structures of our time exploit us most effectively. Social media platforms, driven by sophisticated artificial intelligence, do not operate like traditional media. They don't simply broadcast messages to passive audiences. They observe, they measure, they adapt in real time to your every click, pause, hesitation, and reaction every time you engage, whether by liking a post, sharing an article, or lingering on a video. You provide data. That data feeds algorithms that sharpen themselves with surgical precision, learning how to bypass your conscious reasoning and trigger your emotional reflexes. The result: you are gradually fed an ever narrower stream of content that confirms your existing beliefs, reinforces your biases, and shields you from disconfirming information. Without even realizing it, you drift into what some researchers call algorithmic isolation, a highly personalized reality where your mind is shielded from complexity, ambiguity, and contradiction. In this curated echo chamber, truth becomes increasingly irrelevant. What matters is emotional resonance, how strongly a piece of information aligns with your feelings, your fears, your desire. Bonhoeffer saw the seeds of this dynamic in Nazi Germany, but he could not have imagined how exponentially more dangerous it would become when paired with real-time data harvesting, machine learning, and the global reach of digital platforms. And now, we stand on the precipice of an even darker frontier: AI-generated realities. Deepfake technology can fabricate not just stories, but entire visual and auditory experiences indistinguishable from reality. In the coming years, it will become increasingly difficult, even impossible, for the average person to distinguish between authentic information and fabricated manipulation. This is not science fiction. It is happening now. Bonhoeffer's warning has never been more urgent when people feel threatened, overwhelmed, or uncertain. They become desperately hungry for clarity, and in that hunger, they become susceptible to simplified, emotionally gratifying narratives. No matter how divorced from reality those narratives may be, the terrifying genius of modern manipulation lies in its ability to offer that clarity effortlessly, wrapping it in the comforting language of certainty, moral righteousness, and collective belonging. We witnessed this mechanism operate at full force during the COVID-19 pandemic. Highly educated individuals, doctors, engineers, scientists, lawyers, people trained to analyze complex data, evaluate evidence, and make rational decisions began endorsing disproven treatments, denying established science, and spreading conspiratorial theories. These were not failures of intelligence. They were failures of psychological resilience in the face of immense uncertainty, fear, and social pressure. The pandemic became a live demonstration of Bonhoeffer's thesis: intelligence alone is not enough. Without deliberate cultivation of independent thought, even the most brilliant minds can become vessels for dangerous ideas. And this, perhaps, is the most sobering realization of all. None of us are safe from this vulnerability. No degree, no credential, no achievement insulates us from the pull of functional stupidity. The very belief that we are immune makes us more susceptible, because it blinds us to the subtle ways in which we are constantly being shaped by forces beyond our awareness. Functional stupidity rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with warning sirens or flashing lights. Instead, it seeps into our thinking slowly, whispering reassuring phrases. Everyone else believes this. The evidence is too complicated to sort out. Surely, the experts have it figured out. I don't have time to research this deeply. And with each quiet surrender, the mind relinquishes more of its autonomy. Bonhoeffer's defiance, then, becomes not just a historical act of bravery, but a living model for anyone who seeks to preserve their intellectual integrity in the modern world. He reminds us that thinking independently is not a passive condition, it is an active, ongoing practice that demands daily vigilance. It means seeking out dissenting views not to defeat them, but to test ourselves. It means questioning even the beliefs we hold most dear. It means pausing before sharing emotionally charged information, recognizing that we may be contributing to a larger system of manipulation. It means cultivating the humility to say, "I don't know," rather than grasping at false certainty. And perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing that true intellectual freedom often requires standing alone, especially when the crowd has chosen comfort over truth. In a world increasingly structured to reward quick reactions, simplified narrativas, and tribal loyalty, the deliberate practice of careful thought has become a rare and radical act of resistance. This resistance does not demand perfection. It demands commitment, a willingness to confront discomfort rather than flee from it, to engage complexity rather than avoid it, and to remain curious rather than certain, because the survival of human dignity in the digital age may depend on how many of us are willing to make that choice. As we continue down this road, we confront a harsh reality that few are willing to acknowledge: the global systems that govern information, power, and influence have become perfectly synchronized with our cognitive weaknesses. This alignment makes our susceptibility not a rare failure, but an almost guaranteed outcome, unless we actively fight against it. Bonhoeffer identified this pattern emerging in the political machinery of the Third Reich. But today, the machinery has grown more sophisticated, more efficient, and far more difficult to resist. What was once orchestrated by state propaganda is now embedded into the very infrastructure of our daily lives through algorithms, digital ecosystems, and financial incentives. Consider how modern media operates. Outrage attracts attention. Attention generates clicks. Clicks drive revenue. As a result, complex nuance becomes a liability. While sensationalism becomes currency, simplistic narratives outperform thoughtful analysis not because they are more accurate, but because they are more profitable, and the incentives do not end there. Politicians win elections by offering comforting certainties, not difficult truths. Corporations sell products by exploiting fear, désir, and identity. Social media platforms thrive by feeding users exactly what they want to hear, regardless of its veracity. In such an environment, intellectual surrender is not simply an accident, it is the most rational path for those who wish to avoid the exhausting labor of independent thought. But there's something even more sinister beneath the surface. Modern systems have created what some scholars now call epistemic capture, a condition where entire institutions and populations become locked into self-reinforcing loops of belief. Où sa particulière narrative gain dominance? It filters the information that people receive, shapes the questions they are allowed to ask, and determines which answers are considered legitimate over time. This creates intellectual ecosystems where dissent is not merely discouraged, it becomes unthinkable. The tragedy of epistemic capture is that most of those trapped within it do not even realize they are imprisoned. They feel informed, engaged, and certain. They participate eagerly in the propagation of their chosen narratives, genuinely believing they are defending truth rather than perpetuating illusion. Bonhoeffer's warning echoes here with devastating clarity. He wrote, "The stupid person is often stubborn, but one feels that they are not independent. One is not dealing with them as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and ideologies that have taken possession of them." In this light, stupidity reveals itself not as an absence of intelligence, but as a forfeiture of intellectual autonomy. It is not a passive state, it is an active choice to allow one's mind to be colonized by external forces. And as these forces grow more advanced, they become increasingly invisible. We have now entered an era where artificial intelligence can simulate not only arguments but personalities, emotions, and entire communities. Digital avatar, chatbots, and AI-generated influencers are beginning to shape public discourse, manipulating users through highly personalized interactions that feel authentic but are entirely synthetic. What happens when millions of people unknowingly engage in debates, discussions, and friendships with sophisticated AI agents designed to reinforce their biases? What happens when the boundary between reality and fabrication becomes so thin that most people can no longer distinguish between them? The answer, if we are not careful, is mass intellectual enslavement, a society where vast swaths of the population no longer possess the capacity or even the desire to question the narratives presented to them. And yet, Bonhoeffer offers us a path forward, a narrow, difficult, but essentiel path. It begins with radical self-awareness. We must acknowledge that every one of us carries the seeds of functional stupidity within us. The very structure of our brains inclines us toward certainty, conformity, and simplicity. No one is exempt. This recognition is not cause for despair, it is the foundation of discipline. When we accept that our minds are vulnerable, we become vigilant. We begin to question our instincts. We pause before reacting. We scrutinize not only the information we receive, but our own emotional responses to that information. And we seek out intellectual friction, not as a punishment, but as a form of training, deliberately exposing ourselves to opposing viewpoints, unfamiliar arguments, and challenging ideas strengthens our capacity for independent thought. Just as physical exercise strains muscles to make them stronger, intellectual friction fortifies the mind against the lure of easy certainty. But individual discipline must also be supported by systemic reform. Bonhoeffer understood that stupidity thrives under conditions of fear, instability, and material insecurity. When people are economically desperate, socially isolated, and politically powerless, they become far more susceptible to narratives that offer comfort and identity. Therefore, any serious effort to resist mass stupidity must include efforts to reduce systemic stress, affordable healthcare, economic security, access to unbiased education, transparent governance, media accountability, algorithmic transparency, public investments in media literacy. These are not merely policy preferences, they are essential components of intellectual freedom, because when people are not constantly fighting for survival, they regain the capacity to reflect, to question, and to engage with complexity in a world built to erode thought. Structural stability becomes a prerequisite for mental independence, but perhaps the most important systemic reform of all is cultural. We must rebuild a culture that values humility over hubris, dialogue over dogma, and truth over tribal loyalty. This means creating spaces both physical and digital, where uncertainty is not punished but respected, where changing one's mind is seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness, and where curiosity is honored as the highest intellectual virtue. Bonhoeffer's legacy reminds us that this fight is not optional. The stakes are too high, because the choice we face is not between intelligence and stupidity, but between intellectual independence and intellectual surrender, between the slow, painful discipline of thought and the seductive ease of certainty. And while the forces aligned against independent thinking have grown far more powerful than anything Bonhoeffer could have imagined, the core of his message remains as true as ever. Thinking is what makes us fully human. To surrender that is to surrender everything. As we stand at the intersection of technology, psychology, and society, it's important to fully grasp the magnitude of what we're up against. This is not a temporary phase, nor is it a challenge that will resolve itself over time. It is a growing, accelerating system, a self-reinforcing cycle that feeds on every weakness in human cognition. The machines that gather data from our every move do not sleep. They refine their models by the second. They know which colors hold your attention, which words trigger your emotions, which headlines you're most likely to click. These algorithms don't just predict your behavior, they shape it. And in that shaping lies their quiet power. Where once propaganda had to fight for your attention, today's systems reverse the dynamic entirely. They pull your attention automatically, with almost no resistance. The modern architecture of information doesn't need to convince you. It needs only to keep you engaged long enough to pull you deeper into your own feedback loop. Each click, each share, each emotional reaction tightens the net. This is no longer simply about individual misinformation or isolated bad actors. We are witnessing a wholesale assault on the very concept of truth itself. A world where reality becomes fragmented, subjective, and endlessly customizable, tailored to the psychological profile of each person. And herein lies the ultimate danger Bonhoeffer foresaw when objective reality becomes negotiable. Functional stupidity becomes the dominant mode of existence, because when everyone lives in a separate information ecosystem, disagreement becomes not a healthy exchange of ideas, but a fundamental clash of incompatible realities. We can already see the early consequences of this fracture. Political polarization reaches levels unseen in modern history. Entire communities define themselves not by shared facts, but by mutually exclusive belief systems. Trust in institutions erodes. Science becomes politicized. Expertise is dismissed. Dialogue collapses into shouting matches. In such a world, even attempting to engage in honest discourse becomes increasingly dangerous. The simple act of saying, "Let's examine the evidence together," can be met with hostility, suspicion, or outright hatred. Bonhoeffer would recognize this immediately once stupidity takes hold at the societal level. Correction becomes almost impossible. As he wrote, arguments fall on deaf ears. Attempts to challenge prevailing narratives are not received as intellectual engagement, they are perceived as personal attacks. People do not defend ideas, they defend identities. And when beliefs become identity, any challenge is seen as existential. This explains why even highly educated individuals, those we expect to be the most capable of rational debate, can fall victim to functional stupidity. Their intelligence becomes weaponized in defense of their existing worldview. Rather than evaluating evidence dispassionately, they deploy their cognitive skills to rationalize and reinforce what they already believe. This is why education alone is not enough. Bonhoeffer's theory teaches us that knowledge divorced from humility is powerless against stupidity. In fact, knowledge without humility may actually accelerate the problem, allowing individuals to construct ever more elaborate justifications for their certainty. The real antidote lies in something much harder to cultivate: intellectual virtue, virtues like the courage to admit ignorance, the patience to tolerate uncertainty, the discipline to seek out opposing views, the humility to revise one's beliefs, the integrity to prioritize truth over comfort. These are not qualities that arise naturally. They must be deliberately taught, practiced, and reinforced both at the personal level and across society. And this is where the task becomes even more urgent, because as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, it will increasingly exploit not only our weaknesses, but also our very capacity for self-deception. Deep learning systems are already capable of generating arguments, counter-arguments, and narratives that sound profoundly convincing. They can simulate authority, empathy, and expertise with frightening realism. In the coming years, AI-generated content will not simply inform or misinform, it will create entire realities customized for every individual's psychological profile. If we do not build the internal strength to resist these personalized narratives, we risk a future where truth itself becomes obsolete, not because it no longer exists, but because no one can agree on what it means. The battlefield will no longer be the external world, it will be the battlefield of the mind. Bonhoeffer's question will remain as piercing as ever: who stands fast? Who will choose the lonely road of careful thought when the collective demands simplicity? Who will endure the pain of uncertainty rather than grasp for comforting lies? Who will accept the responsibility of independent judgment when surrender offers such seductive relief? These questions cannot be answered through laws or policies alone. They are deeply personal choices each of us must confront, sometimes daily. Because the truth is, functional stupidity is not a condition we escape once and for all. It is a constant temptation, a gravitational pull that grows stronger the more uncertain the world becomes. Every person, no matter how intelligent, is susceptible. Every society, no matter how advanced, is vulnerable. The struggle for intellectual independence is not won once, it is fought continually. Bonhoeffer's brilliance was not merely in diagnosing the problem, but in recognizing its moral dimension. Stupidity, in his view, was not simply an intellectual failure, it was an abdication of moral responsibility. Because to surrender one's mind is to surrender one's duty, not only to oneself, but to society, to history, and to future generations. Bonhoeffer's confrontation with stupidity was not a detached academic exercise, it was a lived experience, carried out at the risk of his life. His defiance wasn't abstract, it was embodied. He resisted not only a political machine, but a cultural tide that had swept millions into intellectual surrender, and in doing so, he illuminated something. Most people never dare to confront the horrifying ease with which entire populations abandon critical thought for the comfort of collective certainty, he watched a nation of highly educated citizens, scientists, clergy, philosophers, and intellectuals descend into barbarity, not because they were unintelligent, but because they allowed the machinery of fear, conformity, and convenience to do their thinking for them. They exchanged complexity for simplicity, responsibility for obedience, truth for safety. What makes Bonhoeffer's theory so enduring is that it speaks not to one moment in history, but to a timeless vulnerability within the human condition. We are always one crisis, one manufactured threat, one seductive leader away from mass stupidity. And that's precisely why his warning feels more urgent now than perhaps at any point in modern history. We are entering an age in which the sheer volume of information no longer empowers individuals, it overwhelms them. When people are buried under an avalanche of data, facts, opinions, and falsehoods, the instinct for intellectual surrender becomes not only understandable, but almost inevitable. In this state of cognitive exhaustion, people retreat into simplicity not because they prefer ignorance, but because they are simply too mentally depleted to evaluate everything critically. This is where niche-based echo chambers thrive. As information grows more fragmented, people increasingly self-select into intellectual tribes that reflect and reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. Niches offer a seductive promise here. You don't have to sort through the chaos. We'll give you certainty. And in doing so, they become engines of functional stupidity. Inside these carefully curated spaces, dissent is unwelcome, nuance is flattened, and complexity is replaced with slogans. The same mechanism that Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany group, cohesion replacing individual thought, manifests itself across every niche, every ideology, every political faction, and the algorithms ensure that once you've entered one of these ecosystems, escape becomes increasingly difficult. The longer you stay, the more the system feeds you content that aligns perfectly with your beliefs, insulating you from contradiction. Over time, reality itself becomes customized. What you see, what you read, what you believe, it all conforms to the boundaries of your niche. You begin to experience a world where your version of reality is constantly affirmed, while alternative perspectives fade into invisibility. And in that comfort lies the most dangerous form of intellectual decay, because when you no longer encounter opposing viewpoints, you lose the very capacity to evaluate truth at all. This is the mechanism of epistemic collapse, a collapse not driven by malice, but by the architecture of modern life itself. Bonhoeffer's writings expose the terrifying simplicity of this descent. Stupidity, once embedded in a social system, becomes self-perpetuating. The more people surrender their minds to collective narratives, the more those narratives solidify into cultural dogma. And once a culture adopts dogma as truth, questioning becomes heresy. At that point, resistance demands not merely intellectual courage but moral courage, because to stand against mass stupidity is to stand alone. It means inviting criticism, rejection, and even persecution. It means enduring the discomfort of uncertainty when others embrace the safety of certainty. It means defending the slow, difficult process of independent thought in a world that rewards speed, Outrage, and simplicity. But Bonhoeffer's life serves as proof that such resistance, while costly, is possible. He chose to think when others obeyed. He chose to question when others conformed. He chose to stand fast when the entire machinery of his society demanded surrender. And though he paid for that choice with his life, his example remains one of the clearest testaments to the power and necessity of intellectual defiance. Today, We have tools he never imagined, instant access to global knowledge, the ability to connect with dissenting voices across the world, technologies that can amplify independent thought to millions. But these same tools are also the mechanisms through which stupidity spreads. Technology is not inherently liberating or enslaving. It is a mirror, reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of the people who wield it. If we are to survive this new age of informational warfare, we must cultivate not only knowledge, but wisdom. And wisdom, as Bonhoeffer understood, begins with the uncomfortable discipline of self-examination. It begins when we ask ourselves difficult questions. Am I seeking truth or merely affirmation? Do I welcome contradiction or flee from it? Do I value complexity or crave simplicity? Am I defending ideas or defending my identity? These are not casual questions. They are acts of resistance against the creeping paralysis of stupidity, because functional stupidity rarely presents itself as obvious falsehood. It arrives disguised as certainty. It flatters your existing beliefs. It reassures you that you're already right. And in that moment, if you are not vigilant, you surrender your mind. This is where Bonhoeffer's ultimate challenge confronts each of us. The battle is not external. It is not waged by governments, corporations, or algorithms alone. It is fought quietly, invisibly inside every mind that dares to think. The tragedy of stupidity is not its existence. The tragedy is its seduction. Because thinking hurts, it requires you to live with ambiguity, to confront your own biases, to accept that you may have been wrong. It demands patience in a world obsessed with speed, nuance in a world addicted to outrage, and reflection in a world fueled by reaction. But as Bonhoeffer wrote from his cell awaiting death, this discomfort is the price of remaining human in a world that profits from our intellectual surrender. The simple act of thinking for yourself becomes an act of radical defiance. The hardest truth of all is this: none of us are permanently safe. The moment you believe you are immune to stupidity is the moment you become most vulnerable. Every one of us carries within us the same psychological mechanisms that allowed otherwise good, intelligent people to support horrors throughout history. We crave certainty. We avoid pain. We seek belonging. We fear exclusion. And so we trade independent thought for comfort without even noticing we've done it. The price of intellectual freedom, as Bonhoeffer understood, is not simply education, it is eternal vigilance. But within this sobering reality lies hope, because if stupidity is a choice, then so is resistance. If stupidity thrives in the absence of reflection, then reflection is its antidote. If stupidity flourishes in echo chambers, then exposure to uncomfortable truths is its cure. If stupidity feeds on certainty, then humility is our greatest defense. Consider your own life. The next time you feel absolutely certain about something, pause. The next time you feel the urge to dismiss an opposing view without consideration, reflect. The next time you experience the comfort of intellectual confidence, challenge yourself. What would it take to change my mind? If you cannot answer that question, you are already standing on the edge of intellectual surrender. Bonhoeffer's final warning was never about intelligence. It was about courage. The courage to remain curious when certainty feels so much easier. The courage to stand alone when the crowd demands conformity. The courage to think not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. In his final moments, Bonhoeffer whispered, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." He understood what too few of us are willing to face, that to preserve one's mind is to preserve one's soul. The systems of our world, economic, political, technological, will continue to evolve. The threats will grow more sophisticated. The manipulation will become more invisible. The seduction of stupidity will intensify, but the choice remains. You can surrender your mind for the comfort of belonging, or you can guard your mind for the sake of truth. You can drift into the ease of collective certainty, or you can fight for the burden and the dignity of independent thought. The future of our humanity may very well depend on how many of us are willing to stand fast. And so I leave you with the most important question of all. What belief are you willing to challenge this week? Not to torture yourself, not to paralyze yourself in endless doubt, but to practice the discipline that keeps your mind free, because in a world designed to profit from your intellectual surrender, the simple act of thinking remains the greatest act of resistance we have. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, reflection over reaction, you are not just protecting your own mind, you are defending the very possibility of human wisdom. May we all have the courage to stand fast when others have stopped thinking.